This morning we are continuing our walk through the Old Testament. Um, Jaron said his favorite book is The Curse of Greg. I've never heard of that book. Who wrote that book? What is it about? Put these things in the chat. I am curious. Um, so, where are we in the Bible? So we spent a lot of time on Moses. We started with Abraham, right? With Abraham, it was him and his family, they were God's chosen family. But then there were descendants and they became a people, right? Because there were lots of them. And that kind of happened. They became a people in Egypt, but despite being in another country, they never fully assimilated. They kind of retained their own identity. And then, they were slaves in Egypt. It was not cool. And God brought Moses to be a deliverer, and he led them out of Egypt. And then they wandered in the desert for many years because they got all the way to the promised land, which is Canaan, which is modern day Israel, and they were scared. So then God was like, fine, then I'm going to wander till this whole generation is dead, and then you can come back in. So in the end, even Moses wasn't allowed in the promised land. But when they did reach the promised land, there was still that problem of there were all these people living in the promised land. And that's what we talked about last week with Joshua. Joshua was the prophet who kind of led them, kind of a warrior prophet, if you will, and led them in war in Canaan. And we kind of talked about how that's the kind of story that we could struggle with today. And we talked a lot about, did they kill all the Canaanites? And one of the things that I said was that if you read Judges, you would see that they didn't kill all the Canaanites, despite their very much bravado and arrogant claim that they did. And even if it's true, that they went into these cities and killed everyone in the city, there were still people who probably escaped. There were still people who knew they were coming and left in advance. So there were still other people living in the promised land in the time of the Judges, which is what we're going to see today. So one thing I want to talk about is the word prophet. The word prophet can be very confusing in modern speech because to us, a word like prophet means someone who foresees the future. That is not what prophet means. That's not even what prophet means when the New Testament talks about prophesizing. A prophet is someone whom God speaks through. So when we talk about the gift of prophesizing, modern times, usually we're talking about somebody who speaks the truth, right? They speak something that they feel pressed upon by God, and they speak about it, right? So it doesn't mean foreseeing the future. And especially during this time period, it meant people who God talked to, and they were God's mouthpiece to the people. They told the people what God wanted them to do. So during this time period, Israel doesn't have a king. It's not a kingdom. We talk a lot, and we think a lot about the kingdom of Israel, and you think about King David and King Saul, but none of that has happened yet. This is before that. At this time, you have basically 12 loose tribes who are connected to each other by religion, who live in the same area. They're connected by religion and, distantly related, right? And for the most part, they kind of do their own thing, these different tribes. They operate in their own ways. They're not united at all. But occasionally, a prophet comes along who, for various reasons, unites them. So first we had Moses, right? Where, the Israelites had to be united to get out of Egypt. Then you have Joshua, who had to unite them to get them into Israel. But then Joshua dies, and someone becomes a prophet after him, and then another person becomes a prophet after him, etc. This goes on for a long time. The book of Judges is the story of Israel during this time, basically between Joshua and between, it being a kingdom, when it was prophets, aka judges, who ruled is too strong of a word. They didn't rule over Israel, but they delivered God's message to Israel and occasionally would take leadership when they were enacted on by an outside threat. And that's what we're going to see happens a lot in Judges, right? Because these other people in the land of Canaan still exist. And the Israelites kind of came in and were an invading force. um, but you just basically you have a lot of these groups living around, and we've talked about a lot, Trevor likes to use the phrase primitive screwhead, right? These people lived 2,000 years ago, right? Like 1500 to more than, sorry. They lived in like 2000 AD. They lived like 4,000 years ago. They were probably actually around 1500 BC. I would have to look at our timeline in the Sunday school classroom if I could, but I'm not there. But I think, I want to say King David was around 1000 BC. But regardless, this is thousands of years ago, right? These people, in a lot of ways, people that far back, kind of war was what they did. It's what they knew, right? It's how they expanded. They found other people around them very threatening. So, when you have these disparate groups living near each other, they're constantly going to war with each other. To us, it's kind of inexplicable. It's like, just be neighbors. But that's just kind of the way the world was back then. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at specific prophets. This is not every prophet in the book of Judges. In fact, we're skipping like the first one, Ehud, who is famous for being left-handed. It's a weird story. I highly recommend you read it. But we are going to look at Deborah first. And she is one of my favorite prophets. No, not my favorite prophet. That's Gideon. But today we're going to look at this story, and it's very interesting. So please open your Bibles, if you have them, to Judges 4. Judges 4, 1 through 3. So interesting side note while we're thinking about this and turning there is, if I remember correctly, and I'd have to look this up, I think this is one of the oldest sections in the Bible. So you can tell how old a section in the Bible is by the language used. It's kind of like how you can tell that Charles Dickens didn't live today by his word choices, right? You can tell that William Shakespeare was popular in the 1500s by the words he used, right? So the Bible was compiled at different times, but different segments of it were passed down at different things. And some of the oldest things in it are actually songs. I believe the Song of Miriam is one of the oldest things. And then I believe there's a section here in Judges 4 that's actually also very old. And it's also, I think there's a song in this section, and I think it's that. And that makes sense, right? That songs would be one of the oldest things, because before they had writing, before they had the written word, all of this would have been passed down orally. And the way it's easiest to remember things orally is through songs and poems. That's why some of the oldest things we have overall are like, ancient poems, right? People aren't memorizing all of A Christmas Carol and passing it down word for word, right? It can be very hard to memorize prose, but it's much easier to memorize songs and poems, which is why I can recite the preamble of the Constitution thanks to Schoolhouse Rock. Poems and songs make things easier. All right, so Judges 4. Judges 4, 1 through 3. This is what we're going to look at first. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth-ha-goyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, and he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. So these verses set up what's going on, and this is something you're going to see a lot in the book of Judges, right? You have your last prophet. In this case is Ehud. Basically, he dies. And then the Bible's going to be like, and the Israelites stray from God. So to teach them a lesson, God allows a foreign king to come conquer them. And he has a huge army, and he oppresses the Israelites for 20 years. You're going to kind of see this pattern repeated and repeated again. And it's things like this pattern that can sometimes give us weird thoughts about God, where we're like, well, we did bad, so God punishes us. So God is like Santa Claus. You see that a lot in the Old Testament. And though you also see texts in the Old Testament that directly fly in the face of that, like the book of Job, which is kind of the anti-prosperity gospel book of the Bible. What's interesting about this is that there's different ways to interpret it. Is, did they stray from God during that time period when they didn't have a strong prophet? Probably. Did God punish them for their straying? Maybe. Maybe that is what's happening here. Or maybe because they strayed and didn't do what God was asking them to do, this is kind of the natural consequences of those actions, right? So it's less like God being like, I rain down punishment like Zeus from on high, lightning bolts, and more like, you stole and now you have to go to jail. That's not God raining down punishment on you, right? That's the natural consequences of your actions. And there's ways that them straying from the law could cause them to develop weird relationships with their neighbors, the Canaanites, and them to kind of get more chummy with the Canaanites than they should. That could lead to kind of these hostilities, and then the Canaanites being like, well, they're no different than us. They're just another group of us, so I should conquer us. So there's kind of different ways to interpret that and look at that. All right, so moving on. This is the setup. They're feeling all oppressed by the Canaanites. They're like, woe is us, God, help us. This guy has like 900 chariots, which would be like the equivalent of he has 900, army tanks today. Chariots were kind of like the army tanks back in the day. All right, so Judges 4:4-5. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. So the new prophet is a woman named Deborah. The Israelites may be oppressed, but they still have this judge, this religious leader that they can go to, and it's Deborah. The text says she sits under a tree and people come to her for judgments. So why hasn't she gone out and conquered these invaders like Joshua or Moses might have? Well, it says God allowed Jabin to oppress the Israelites. And if that's really what happened, then Deborah's not going to go against God's will. But they may not have also had the momentum from the people to do it, right? But then finally God tells her it's time for them to be free. And she's not going to go against that either, which is what we're about to see. So Judges 4:6-9. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take position at Mount Tabor. Bring 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead you to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Deborah summons a guy named Barak. I always like to point out that name should be familiar. It's Obama's first name, Barack Obama. So Barak is a biblical name. It's right here in Judges 4. So anyway, Deborah calls this guy. Deborah, also a very common name at our church. I think 2 of our pastors' wives are named Deborah. But Deborah calls this guy Barak to her and basically says, God says it's time to be free. You're going to lead us to victory. Take out the army and free us. And you're going to be the general who does this. And Barak is basically like, okay, but I don't want to go alone. Could you come with me? Is he scared to go alone? Maybe. That's how I just portrayed it right there, right? Or maybe he knows all the stories about prophets in the past leading Israel to freedom. And he knows he's no prophet, right? Like Moses raising his hand so they beat the army. Or Joshua with the Ark of the Covenant out front. He's like, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet of God. I need a prophet of God there. That's you, Deborah. Come on. So maybe he's thinking having a prophet there will cause the people to remember those stories and for them to fight harder. Or maybe he's scared. Regardless, it does show that Barak doesn't have complete faith in the instructions that Deborah has given him. So Deborah got her instructions from God. Deborah has given Barak these instructions, and Barak is questioning those instructions. He's saying, you have to come with me. He wants to add on to the instructions he has been given, which we've already seen from Moses' time can get you in trouble, right? Deborah responds that she will obviously go with him if that's what he wants. I mean, the priority here is that they be free, and if he needs her to come, she will come. Deborah, is like, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But what she does say is, I'll come if you want me to come. But because you're not fully trusting what I told you, which could be a variety of reasons. You're either not fully trusting God or you're not fully trusting me. Because you're not trusting, it will not be you, Barak, who's remembered for this victory. It will be a woman. Sisera, the bad general, will be delivered to the hand of a woman. Now, when you're reading this, you'll be like, well, that's Deborah, right? But we'll see. And remember, it is important for us to talk about that back then, women were not considered equal to men. Not even close. Women were generally considered to be a little better than property. So, you could have a free wife and a slave wife, and there's a very fine line on what makes you different, right? Kind of the difference between a wife and a slave is you pay for a slave, and they pay you for a wife. It's weird. It's dowries. So Deborah was chosen by God. And so the men of her time probably respect her more, but that doesn't mean they respect all women, right? It's kind of like Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth I. These were powerful women in times when women were not considered powerful. But if you talked to the average Victorian or Elizabethan man, they'd be like, well, Victoria or Elizabeth was chosen by God. So that's why she gets to rule. But that doesn't mean my wife has a brain. That doesn't mean she has opinions that are worthwhile. That doesn't mean I should take my wife or daughter's opinion into matters. That queen is special. She's got special abilities, but the average woman is not special, right? So Barak might have this pedestal version of Deborah in his mind where she's chosen by God, so she's special. But that doesn't mean every woman is equal to me. And so saying that the glory is going to go to a woman, that would be very insulting to most dudes at that time. Because basically they didn't consider women to be real, full people. So this is Barak's punishment, that his glory is going to go to a woman. Now, of course, it's also possible that Barak is a good general who doesn't really care about glory. So it's not much of a punishment at all. Maybe he only cares about getting his people free. And if that's true, then he won't care that Deborah or some random woman gets the glory for this, as it's God's glory and God's people are freed. And that is definitely the way he should view it. But knowing how people work probably still stings a little. That out of all of the people in this story, the average person doesn't remember Barack exists. To the point where most people didn't know that Barack Obama's first name was a biblical name. That's how unremembered Barack is. Of course, if the writer of Judges had really wanted him to be unremembered, they wouldn't have given it a name. But sadly, they always give men names. But Deborah is definitely the person most remembered in this story. And then another woman that we're going to talk about shortly is the second most remembered person in this story. All right, so keeping going. Judges 4:10-13. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had camped as far away as Elon Bazanenim, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Hasereth HaGoyim to the Wadi Kishon. So Barak does as he's told, and it doesn't go unnoticed, because when you're gathering a large army, it's hard to hide it. So the Kenites were allies with the Israelites, claiming they're descended from Moses' in-laws. But for some reason, this guy Heber sides with the other team in this fight. So when he sees Barak gather all these men, he basically goes and tattles on him to the enemy general, Sisera. So the enemy general is like, heck no, I'm not letting an insurrection happen on my watch. And he gathers his massive army to fight them. Now, when you're looking at this, you'd be like, oh, well, Barak has 10,000 warriors. Surely 10,000 warriors can overcome 900 chariots. But it doesn't really work that way, right? Because remember, you need to think of chariots as like army tanks. It's very hard for a bunch of little guys to overcome a tank, right? So Sisera's got the big weapons here, and the Israelites do not. So not looking good for the Israelites. All right, Judges 4:14 through 17. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera put down his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Hasharoth HaGoyim. All the armies of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was a peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. So, Deborah tells Barak that today is the day. Today is the day you gotta fight Sisera. So Barak goes out with his 10,000 men. And we don't really have details of how the battle goes down, how Barak's 10,000 men overcome these 900 chariots. But they do. Barak's army tears through them like a hot knife through butter. I think we can safely say the Israelites are successfully defeating their enemies in this battle, according to the text we're given. But Sisera is trying to get away. That's the enemy general, remember. He gets out of his chariot, presumably his horses are dead or something, and flees on foot all the way to Heber's camp, and Heber's actual tent. Now remember, Heber's the guy who tattled on the Israelites to Sisera. So Heber is his friend. Heber is probably not even in this fight. It's just that his campsite's pretty close by. Heber is allied with Sisera, but there's a difference between allies who will spy for you and allies who will die for you. You know, Heber's may not necessarily be the ride or die kind, right? But he is the kind of ally who will shelter Sisera. So he's like, I'm not going to go to battle with you. I'll spy for you. I'll shelter you. But I'm not going to risk my life out there. So Sisera runs into this tent and ends up at the tent of Heber's wife, Jael. Jael, depends on how you want to pronounce it. If you pronounce it like Michael, then it's Joel. All right, so someone read or not someone. I have to read it. There is no someone. No. I will read Judges 4:18 through 20. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." So Jael, the wife of Heber, comes out and meets him. This is her husband's ally. And she's like, "You can come in here and we will keep you safe and hide you." And he believes her because he has no reason not to. His ally's wife, right? So he comes in, she hides him by covering him with a rug, and then he's like, "I'm thirsty." And so she gives him milk. She's taking very good care of him. She's being a good hostess, but he's still very demanding, right? And he's like, "Can you stand at the entrance of the tent? And if anybody asks you if anyone's in here, just like cover for me and say no," right? And she's like, "Sure, my lord, I will totally do that for you." And then he falls asleep. And end of story. He survives, right? No. Judges 4:21. But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Jael straight up kills this dude. He falls asleep in her tent, where she offered him shelter, where according to this time period, hospitality is pretty important. She gives him stuff to drink, pretends like she's going to hide him, and then when he falls asleep, does she protect him? No! She drives a tent peg through his head. She's not playing around. Tent pegs would be big, right? That's what holds your tent in the ground. She takes a hammer, she takes a tent peg, stakes him like a vampire, except straight through the head like a zombie. All right. So why does she kill him when her husband is his ally? Well, husbands and wives are not always on the same page, especially back then when your husband might just treat you like property. Now, husbands and wives, you want to be friends, right? You should marry someone you're friends with. You should be a team. You're on the same page. That's not how things worked back then. Husbands basically bought wives. Or they were traded for political favors or, connections. There's all sorts of reasons a woman may end up with a man back then that had nothing to do with love. It had nothing to do with having the same values. It had nothing to do with even friendship. So she may not even like her husband at all. But people back then would have taken it for granted that a wife is supposed to do what her husband says. So if a husband allies with someone, the wife is obviously allied to him too. Because the wife is generally so subjugated by her husband, so overwhelmed, oppressed by him, basically, that she couldn't go against him without major repercussions. Men could beat their wives back then and not get in trouble. I think you could still get in trouble for killing your wife, but fine line there. So a woman taking her own life into her hands to defy her husband is a big deal. Jael is obviously still loyal to the Israelites, as most Kenites were. It was only her husband. The Kenites were the Israelites' ally. It was only Heber who was spying for Sisera. So maybe Jael is an Israelite. We don't know. Or maybe she's just like, these people are our friends. These people are our allies. And you have betrayed them. You have gone against something that's greater than the husband-wife contract. You have gone against, our relationship with God and God's chosen people. So she... maybe that's why she did it. Or maybe she saw what Jabin was doing to the Israelites and disagreed. Or maybe she loved and trusted God and knew this was what God wanted her to do. We don't know why she did it, but we know she made a decision independent of her husband's will and did what she thought was right. Judges 4:22 through 24. Then as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." And so he went into her tent, and there was Sisera, lying dead, with a tent peg through his temple. So on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. And then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan, until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. There's a lot of repetition there, King Jabin of Canaan. Barak pursues Sisera, and Jael comes out to meet him and is like, "I've got him for you." She takes him to the tent and shows him Sisera, dead as a doornail, or maybe in this case, dead as a tent peg. And so between Barak's army and Jael's swift actions, the Israelites win the day. Jabin is overthrown, and the Israelites are freed. This victory is rarely talked about as Barak's victory, even though he was the general who led the troops. Deborah's words have come true. This victory is tightly tied to two women, Deborah and Jael. It was Deborah's leadership and Jael's quick thinking that led to this pretty decisive victory. This story is important for a number of reasons, but mainly because it is a story that focuses on women in roles that normally aren't, they're roles they aren't normally given in society, even fairly modern society. For thousands of years, women have been kept out of leadership roles, told that it's simply something women are not capable of, something we're not built for. For thousands of years, women have been told they are not capable of being soldiers, of making tough decisions that need to be made. Women have been told to behave and be a certain way. And if a woman existed outside of those bounds, if she dared to do something different, she was not treated well. In this story, we have two women who do what God requires of them, even if it goes directly in the face of what society requires of them as women. Because those are not the same thing. What God requires of us and what society requires of us do not always align. Most of our gender roles that we follow are not attributed to God. They are attributed to Victorian ideals. They are attributed to our society, right? And it can be very hard for us to discern these differences. And I'm sure, it was hard for Deborah and Jael. But God required Deborah to lead. It didn't matter that the Israelites had a patriarchal culture. God is not patriarchal. God is not their patriarchal culture. And he called Deborah to lead, just as he has called Ehud, Joshua, and Moses before her. God required Jael to be a soldier. even though women were not allowed to be soldiers back then. And women were certainly not allowed to go against their husbands. But Jael did both because it is what God required of her. We answer to God first, always. There are many denominations still today of Christianity that tell women they are not equal to men. That women are supposed to do and behave certain ways. But we see clearly in this story that that is not God's rule. Deborah and Jael are far from the only women in the Bible to make decisions for God and to lead and to do things that society may not view as appropriate for women. We already talked about Rahab, who hid Hebrew spies from her people. She betrayed her people. She lied to her king. She did what she needed to do, right? And because of that, she's remembered forever in the lineage of Jesus. We will talk about Ruth, Naomi, Esther, Anna, Junia. There are so many women who are more than the boxes that society has tried to place them in. So we're going to flip to the New Testament real quick. Galatians 3:28. Remember, this is a letter written by Paul to the church at Galatia. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. What Paul is saying here is it doesn't matter if you're a girl or a boy, a Jew or not, poor or rich, oppressed or privileged. Before God and Jesus, we're all the same. God can and does use us all for his glory and purpose. We are all here to serve God. We are held to the same standard, and we all serve the same God. Imagine if Deborah and Jael had let their cultural norms override what God had asked them to do. Imagine if Jael had been like, I have to do what my husband wants. I'm not supposed to kill people. And she let Sisera, she hid him from Barak. Imagine if Deborah had refused to lead. If God had been like, Deborah, I need you to step up. And she was like, God, I know you're telling me to do this, but my society says women aren't allowed to do this. Therefore, you must be wrong, God. That seems crazy, right? That seems crazy. But we literally still live in a society that tells girls this. I was told this growing up, that the way God made me was basically wrong. Outspoken, opinionated, knowledgeable, smart. That those aren't things that women are supposed to be. And who was I to question my gender norms? Because clearly, the gender norms are God's norms. But we see that is not the case here. There are always people that God calls. And God, as we see over and over again in the Old Testament specifically, always calls the people we least suspect. He doesn't call the oldest son, even though societal norms would say it should be the oldest son who gets everything. He doesn't call he doesn't call Barak, even though he is the general, the leader, the guy who has the knowledge and ability to wage a war. He doesn't call him to lead. He calls Deborah. He doesn't have a soldier meet Sisera and kill him. He has a woman, a wife of a spy at that. But who else would have been able to get Sisera except the person who least suspected it? God uses us all. You really think God would look at half the population and say, I can't use you fully. I can only use these menfolk. No, God uses all of us. He uses all of us. From the least likely, from the seventh son to, to the children, to the women. He takes the lunch from a kid and feeds 5,000, right? He passes over Jesse's older sons to choose David. He picks, as we're going to see later, Gideon, who's scared all the time. He picks Moses, who can't talk, right? God picks from everyone. He uses everyone. There is no societal role. There is no disability. There is no, cultural norm that is more important than what God calls us to do. And that is why I think the story of Deborah and Jael is so important. It's one of the few biblical examples we get of women doing exactly as God wants them to do, living the life God wants them to, and that includes traditionally non-feminine activities. Male or female, we are not beholden to society's view of gender roles. We are beholden to God. And that is the most important role in our life, is to be a follower of Christ. So that is the end of our lesson. Let me stop the recording and then we'll do prayer requests.